Awesome. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Jess Ngo, and I am a technical manager at MSI supporting our youth, peace, and stability work. I'm also a co-chair of the Youth Employment Working Group, the Scaling Youth Employment Working Group, along with my colleagues Hisham Jabi and Elizabeth Vance. So before we get into today's session, I'd just like to extend a warm welcome to our 6th annual workshop of the Global Community Practice on Scaling Development Outcomes, and just provide some brief overview of the community. So we currently have over 900 members, and to those of you who are not members yet, a special welcome to you and an open invitation to join us. We are only as strong as our members, and each new voice really makes us stronger. So we encourage you to join. And the COP is completely voluntary and free of charge. So the scaling community more broadly is dedicated to advancing and professionalizing the practice of scaling by learning across different sectors, geographies, and perspectives. In addition to this annual workshop, the community issues quarterly newsletters and operates 9 working groups, including this one, that explore scaling through lenses of various sectors and thematic issues. Each of the working groups hold quarterly meetings and has a webpage on the community website. And our team will share a link to the Scaling Community of Practice website in the chat. And if you also want to know more, please, of course, feel free to reach out to us. We'll share the email address as well in the chat. And then finally, just wanted to share some the usual housekeeping remarks. So the session is being recorded. We ask that you please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. Please, of course, feel free to put comments and questions in the chat at any time. And feel free to raise your hand during the Q&A if you'd like to ask a question as well. So thanks so much for joining us. I'd like to pass it over to my co-chair, Elizabeth Vance, who will introduce our guest speaker today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jess. Today we are going to be in conversation with Rene Espinosa. Rene is here with his camera on, and he is the president of the Mexican Federation of Aerospace Industries. He has been in the aerospace industry for over 18 years, specifically focused on chemical processing and surface finishing for metal and aluminum parts. He has a master's degree in project management at the ESDEN Business School in Madrid, Spain, and is currently directing metal finishing company's operation in Chihuahua, Mexico. Through the years, Rene has developed experience in supply chain integration and development, and he led Chihuahua's aerospace cluster for 5 years, and we'll be speaking about that experience today. And has recently been appointed the president and a member of the board of directors of the Mexican Federation of Aerospace Industries. He is a member of the board of directors of Index Chihuahua, which is an export-oriented manufacturing cluster in Chihuahua, Mexico, and is a founding member of the Mexican Association of Surface Finishing, AMAS. We're going to be speaking today about engaging the private sector and private sector firms in workforce development processes. I have a series of questions for Rene that he's graciously agreed to answer, but we thought we would start with a short presentation about how Rene and I got to know each other. And I'd just like to highlight that Rene, from day one, has been a champion for workforce development from the private sector. And when I think of someone who is able to transform a calcified education system, I think of Rene. So I figured if there's anyone that we would like to hear from in our work group as we look at engaging the private sector in workforce, it would be him. So thank you, Rene. I'm going to give a brief presentation, and Rene, I'm going to invite you, if I skip something important, to please interrupt me. I'm going to share a bit about our experience working together in Chihuahua, Mexico, in the education to employment ecosystem, and how we work together to transform it. So first, I just want to give a brief overview of the education to employment ecosystem in Chihuahua, where Rene lives and works. So on the education side, these are sort of players that we are used to seeing in this group. We have upper second, so these are all the TVET providers. We have upper secondary providers, all public. We have short-term training providers, public and private in here, higher education, both public and private, some R&D firms. These are actually, these two are public, this one is private, state education authorities for a decentralized system, and then the regional secretary of education, and the national educational authorities. And I want to highlight that we found that industry has its own hierarchy. So we have, for the aerospace sector, we have 40 plus certified providers to multiple OEMs all in one state. So some of these you may recognize: Cessna, Honeywell, Beechcraft, Hawker. There are others, Bell Helicopter, and Cayman, that I didn't know about until I began working there. And these are all organized. This entire supply chain is organized in a cluster, which in Mexico, we have the great fortune that clusters are not just economic geographers' technical terms, they're actually organizations. You call them, there's a president, there's staff. And that is fiscally sponsored by the local export-oriented manufacturing chamber. And then there's a national industry association, FEMIA. And I'd like to sort of highlight where Rene sat. He worked at, he continues to work at Metal Finishing, which is an important firm in the aerospace supply chain. He was the president of Chihuahua's aerospace cluster, currently sits on the board of the Regional Industrial Chamber, and is the president of FEMIA. And here's how, at the time, the aerospace cluster was organized. And I think this is important to see how it sort of works, their own organization. So there was again, their industrial chamber sat on top. There was an aerospace cluster director. His name is Jose Luis Rodriguez. He works in the aerospace sector today. There's an on-staff cluster manager whose name is Monica Vega. She has since moved on to FEMIA. And there's two important honorary members. One is the Secretary of the Economy at the time. That was Manuel Rusek Valles. And then the Secretary of Education. Again, these two change as the elected officials change. And then they have some functional leaders, and they have a technical council. I'd like to highlight that one firm is really important in this ecosystem. It's American Industries, and they are not an aerospace company per se. They rent industrial real estate and provide HR and other services to foreign companies and local ones seeking to incorporate themselves into the supply chains in Chihuahua, Mexico. They have every interest that this sector continues to grow, and their staff dedicates their own staff time to further the goals of this and other industrial clusters in the region. And then as we know, a system is not just a collection of actors. It's defined by how things flow. So I'd like to highlight that when we started working there, there were some really important flows. We found that many of the certified providers were receiving training and R&D from local providers. And there was a conversation between short-term training providers and the OEMs about critical skills. But there was no conversation about how to generate each year a class of technicians or university graduates that was required by the sector as a whole. As Mexico's export promotion agency had begun to map, along with the government of the state of Chihuahua, what were the capabilities that the cluster had at this time, and how were they held by different companies. It inspired the cluster to begin to do a really serious mapping of what were the functions that they needed to have within their supply chain in order to make an airplane or airplanes from tip to tail in Chihuahua. And this helped them generate a strategic plan for growth within their sector. It included not only making an airplane from tip to tail, but also attracting investment for a maintenance, repair, and overhaul facility, which is sort of like an auto shop for planes. It's where you take your plane regularly for maintenance, and also where you take it when something's wrong. These are critical employment generators and are highly sought after by aerospace clusters around the world. One of the largest in our hemisphere is in San Salvador. And what they were able to do with this strategic map was to identify, if we want to be able to take on these new functions as a cluster, what are the new critical skills that we will need in order to get us there, and how many new workers will we need with these skills? So they came up with a rather precise analysis of what the critical skills were and what the gap was, or what their demand was. And this, I'd like to highlight, is not what we normally find when we work with industry. This was a high level and clear analysis of the skills that they needed. So when IYF arrived, we arrived with a modest investment and partnered with a local foundation that put forward some important funds as well. We partnered with the Regional Industrial Chamber, the Aerospace Cluster, and the smallest of the upper secondary school systems, which is called CONALEP, but it's also decentralized. And we partnered with all of the upper secondary systems to start to understand what was the skills gap for the aerospace cluster, taking into account their strategic plan for growth. And we charted the demand for particular skills in the aerospace industry, which is the orange line here, compared to the number of graduates per year from the upper secondary system. The intensity of the columns here reflects the number of hours of relevant skills a technician has. And we charted this starting the year that we began work and projecting towards the future. And together with these three technical systems and the cluster, we came up with a plan to increase the number of graduates and increase the number of hours that they had that were relevant in their studies. And with this, we were able to secure $25 million in in-kind contribution from the Center of Excellence for Aerospace and Advanced Manufacturing, which worked in partnership through a TACT grant under the Obama administration with community colleges in Spokane, Washington, and Boeing to develop this curriculum. Because it was developed with federal funds, it was in the public domain, and we were able to secure it with support from USAID's lawyers. And we converted that into 2 technical specialties written to the technical high school level, which is similar, but slightly less advanced as a community college for which it was developed. And it also all needed to be translated and validated by local firms that this was relevant. However, because many of these certified providers were part of Boeing's supply chain, the critical skills were relevant. There was indeed a translation need. We involved a local short-term training provider, COMEX, in order to train the teachers and do an advanced manufacturing curricular upgrade as well. Finally, we developed project-based materials science curriculum, working with their local materials science R&D center that was incorporated into the science classes of all high school students throughout the state. And this brought on board all 3 technical high school systems, not just the smallest and most autonomous. And I sort of like to highlight how we think of this. You know, IYF, we're not aerospace specialists at all. but we do know how to facilitate dialogue, align incentives, and provide tools and tech expertise. And when we think about a workforce system, when we take it down to the level of a workplace, a TVET provider, and a student, we help workplaces describe their demand and skills. And in this case, the aerospace sector did not need our help doing that. We work with TVET providers to orient students to opportunities and to align curriculum, which can inspire workplaces to offer internship opportunities and feedback, which we found many TVET providers need support to manage relevant and quality internships. And if all these three things come together, if you're oriented to what degree program, you study an aligned curriculum, and you have an opportunity to participate in a relevant and quality internship at a workplace in a sector, you develop relevant skills as a young person. And one would hope that you could translate these skills into employment, which would allow workplaces to access qualified applicants. But we know that many young people going to public technical high schools don't have the networks and family experience to take a degree, a technical degree, and turn it into employment in the formal sector. And so that's why we support TVET providers to provide job placement training and tools. And when all this works together, we suddenly get a virtuous cycle that no longer needs IYF's participation. And we found that to be the case with the aerospace sector. We continue to stay in touch not only with Renee, but with the Secretary of Public Education and the technical high schools. And we found that they've added one more, which is the largest high school system in the state, which is offering the material science curriculum. And they've recently launched a new work training program in partnership with the aerospace cluster. And I think a lot of this has to do with figuring out how to find your champions and how to understand power structures within a sector, and how to move people for support. And I think that one of the critical things we did here is we had a series of early wins that motivated some initial skeptics to come on board. So at first, I'd like to highlight that the aerospace cluster was excited, but they were a little cautious because they had tried to work in the past with the public schools and had been burned. Index was a bit more excited, but a little less relevant. They didn't have the critical information that we needed from the aerospace cluster. Once we were able to provide the technical specialties, the aerospace cluster became completely on board, which was able to move over the Secretary of Public Education and the two non-centralized technical education providers, the R&D centers, the National Aerospace Association, other training providers, and R&D. And this really helped us create a functioning ecosystem where the entire supply chain was seeing value created. And so I'd like to highlight that there were a couple new things that happened. We now had more information flows and training flows between the education providers, but also the flows of information went not only from the cluster to the short-term training providers, but to the educational authorities in the state so that they could respond with new curriculum provided to all students. We feel that they're still missing a labor market information system in the state. Many vacancies are published on banners posted outside of factories. Articulation agreements between upper secondary and higher education systems to provide us strategic insights, and a governance and fiscal sponsorship that sits between the private and public sector. So there's still work to be done. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I would like to first ask Renee if he has anything to add, if I missed anything. And then I have a series of questions for Renee that I'm excited to ask him, but I would also like to invite everyone, if you have questions for Renee or for myself, to please put them in the chat or open your mic, and we'd be excited to hear from you. So Renee, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Liz. No, it was pretty much, you were taking me through a timeline story and just remembering everything. I mean, I wish I could say that I was the guy, but I think there's so many people that was involved in this, and the teamwork that we experience and the interest in trying to develop a ecosystem where we will have the skills on our future employees. I think that was one of the biggest motivations. Also, I would like to add that after that first exercise that we did through those 3 years, it has been a benchmark now. Several other projects have evolved with other education institutions that back then didn't want to participate, that were kind of, holding and trying to see if it was going to work or not. Right now, for instance, through Index, we just finished a Kaizen program with several universities and technical schools in which we make little groups on all these institutions in order to have these Kaizen programs, and they will present in English to corporate in order to, incentivize more that the skill of having a second language, to understanding how is the real world. And I think we gained so much, and at this point we're still finding out more results that probably we didn't see back then. I mean, it's still going, the results. It's impressive and it's exciting. And also the work that you did, Liz, with Jorge, and it still lingers. I mean, now we're trying to replicate this in other states, in Querétaro. Other states are looking at us because we were the first region in Mexico that we were able to modify the academic curricula, the hours, and adapt them to what we were needing and what we were foreseeing that we were going to need as an industry.
Thank you so much. I have 3 follow-up questions to that, Rene. Yeah. First, I'm going to ask you a little bit about my first question is, how did the aerospace cluster come to see this skills mismatch as a business imperative? And how is this seen specifically at your firm?
Well, I like the concept you use, business imperative. I mean, the biggest and largest, most important resource in any company is our people. I mean, it sounds sometimes cheesy, but it's not. I mean, truly, we need skilled people. And back then, I want to go a little bit more back in time, and the cluster originated basically as a committee of human resources back then. I'm talking about back 2007, 2008. We, in Index, there were not many aerospace companies, and they were stealing the employees. There was a big fight of HR people, and when you look at the definition of a cluster, some definitions say it is a conglomerate or a group of companies sharing the same needs in the same industry and sector. And I think that was a very natural way the cluster was created and how it started. It started as a committee of HR because the companies that were back then established, they were stealing their skilled and trained people. And that is not fair. That's one of the first business imperatives. You cannot grow, you cannot develop, you cannot bring other new companies if there's not a field of trained and skilled people. Through the years, the needs started to grow, and it became from a committee into a formal cluster with very specific points of actions, and one of them was academic entitlement. And I remember a lot of universities wanted to create an aerospace program. And we said, no, we don't need aerospace engineers. We do not design planes. We do not, we're not designing, you know. And they asked us, well, what do you want? Well, you can continue having mechanical engineers, technical guys in maintenance, in electronic, industrial engineers, any engineering, but let's adapt their skills to what we need, because what you're giving us is a huge gap with what we need in our production floor. At the end of the day, aerospace industries continue being a manufacturing sector. So I think taking that perspective, that background, and the needs, we were trying to, like you showed that roadmap, we did it back in 2013. There's no way we can develop any of those fields we identified if we don't have the right trained people.
So I have a question. I remember when we had a proposal to change the technical curriculum. I think that there were many important ways that the cluster and the aerospace forums supported our request. IYF made a specific technical request to different academic authorities, but I don't think anyone would have said yes without the aerospace cluster behind us.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about what that support looked like?
Absolutely. I think it's pretty hard to dance alone. So if the educational institutions want to develop programs to what the industry needs, and the industry needs to develop those skills, those careers focused on the ecosystem where they're established, we need to make it together. And I think it was a very normal, unfortunately, very normal reaction from the Secretary of Education to kind of like look from behind and say, okay, you know, are they in or not? If they're in, we're there.
Yeah.
And I think the moment we started understanding each other, because we always thought that there is this academic entitlement, but there was not really. Until we sat down, we start talking, and I think that's where the authorities at the state and federal government, they realize, okay, this is serious, and having the approval of the industry, that is a major statement in order to start working.
So I have a question from Catherine Honeyman from the audience. She'd like to know, first she says that this is a great presentation so far. So Renee, we're doing awesome. She has a question for you. What did it cost companies to engage in this initiative? And how did they justify and cover these costs? So for example, I'd like to remind you of some costs there was a lot of time. I remember we had our curriculum developer with the curriculum that we had brought in from the States, and we had multiple technicians from multiple firms for a month of meetings. It wasn't a small investment of time. Can you talk a little bit about that expense and how they were justified internally?
Sure. Most of the companies that we operate in Mexico, we report to a corporate in another country. But I think the leadership of the directors, of the managers of the operation was vital. I remember authorizing my quality manager to go on the weekends to train the teachers, to spend 12 hours on Saturday and 6 hours on Sunday. But I think there was not really something that we pushed that you have to do it. I think everyone was so enthusiastic about it. Everyone really wanted to support. I think we understood, and the directors and managers were able to pass that vision and need to the engineering managers and the mid supervisors. So there was really this desire of doing it. It was really interesting how we all, the companies in that time, put our resources, and I think it's not necessarily sometimes the economic resource, as you said, the time and our people, and they were willing to do it. And I remember they questioned me from corporate office. They say, "What you guys doing?" And I said, "Well, if we do this, this is what we're trying to do. That in order to have skilled people that we can work with, that they understand the industry, the systems of aerospace, because there was not so much happening back then." And I think that there was a win-win, and that's when then the corporate offices started to be involved and really supporting these activities.
I think Hisham has a question. I'd like to just add on to Renee's piece there. I think one of the critical pieces was early wins fast. I think that it's difficult to keep people engaged with all of these internal stakeholders if you don't show results quickly. So when we looked at a curriculum alignment effort, while many in Mexico, at least planned, have a timeline of 5 years between the time you start talking and the time you graduate your first technician, that's too long. They were able to have interns practicing in their factories within 6 months of starting talking with us, that were studying the curriculum, and graduates within 18. And I think that a quick turnaround with an initial win is really important to demonstrate results. Because I think that, as you can hear from Renee, there was a lot of enthusiasm, and this was aligned with their growth plan. But if it hadn't shown results in a short time period, for the public sector, a short time period, a very long time period in terms of the private sector, I don't think they would have stayed as engaged. Right. I saw that Hisham had a question, and then I have 2 questions in the chat from Johannes and Rachel.
Thank you very much, Renee and Liz. Very rich presentation. I really like the system approach, Liz. I mean, I know you are a very big believer in system change, so I really appreciate that. The question actually is building on what Catherine's question is about the cost. You know, in private sector, you have this narrative that really we want to invest in labor market, and labor mobility is very important, and competition is very important. So how do you strike a balance between investing as a private sector industry versus turning your company into a training center where you train young people, then somebody else will come and grab them? Very hard to make the case to corporation. How did you succeed to do that? Fascinating, Renee. Thank you.
Thank you. That's still a challenge. I can tell you that probably a year we have 6 to 8 students from that program in my facility doing their, now we're talking about more like dual education, and you know the program keeps evolving, you know, or they're interns, or we want to call them. And I mean, you have great kids, you know, that they arrive and they thrive, and we have amazing stories. And I think there's, in my company, we're a smaller company. I mean, I'm not a big Honeywell or Safran Group, you know, and we know that it's going to be temporary, and we really focus. Now I think something that we develop as companies is to really think, what project are we going to give to these students? Because I told my team, I told my team, I don't want these kids making copies. I don't want these kids moving boxes in the offices. If we start doing that, and that was something it was probably one of the conditions of this program with every single company. going back to the question, we really think about projects that are going to add value, that are going to solve problems internally, in which sometimes I don't have the budget to have a project management engineer focused on black belt type of programs to diminish costs. So what we've done is, okay, let's talk to this institution, let's get 3 students with this profile from the program, and let's give them this project. They're going to work for months. They're going to solve it for us. They get paid every month, and I think there's a win-win. I mean, we solve something. A lot of times it's temporarily. I've been able to retain some of the kids, and I know they're gonna move on, you know. But sometimes there's a temporary win-win. Sometimes there's a long-term. I think
Renee, you're on mute. Sorry.
I got muted, right?
Yes, you're no longer muted.
Okay.
You said sometimes it's long term, and then we lost you.
Yeah, and then it's temporarily, but I've been very successful in solving a lot of things in which sometimes corporate will not authorize me a full-time person. And another thing that we've seen is that we're not fighting anymore to steal those, you know, labor-wise, to be trying to steal employees, and oh, there's no students ready. I think it's something that we probably never imagined we were going to win when we started this.
Thank you so much, Renee. We have a bunch more questions for you. The next question is from Johannes, and then Larry has his hand raised, and then we have a question from Rachel, and then Ruth. So Johannes also thinks this is a great case, a very interesting case study. And he said, it looks like IYF played an important intermediary role, yes, but then we exited. So what did, and then he wants to know what we did to ensure sustainability and scaling beyond our projects and an exit. But I'd like to ask Renee, who you see in Chihuahua continues to carry this torch for this program.
Is the aerospace cluster and index. Something that changed after the IYF participation is that, I mean, I gotta recognize what Jorge did was amazing. That you guys keep accountable the educational institutions. I remember very hard meetings saying, guys, you need to fulfill this timeline, this Gantt, you're late. In the industry, we have another pace. We're used to timelines, we're used to crunch time. Sometimes in the education institutions are not, and the role that you guys play was fantastic because it was very intense. You guys were able to make it happen at that time. And after that, in the cluster, that's when we identified, okay, these guys are gone. We need to have a periodic involvement, meetings. Now the education institutions are a member of the cluster. They have a minimum representative fee in order for just to have a cost and be part of it. And by having that, they also found the value they get from participating and creating programs and being at the table with the directors of other companies. So I think it was something that we discovered as an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to add on the educational side, we had a staff member that we placed at the local foundation, and I'd like to name her because she is a force of nature. Her name was Ceci Cano, mm-hmm. And she was actually pirated from us at the end of the project by the Secretary of Education, yes, to continue this work. And if I've ever seen someone that plays the role of the honeybee, that does cross-pollination of ideas and convenes people together in such a powerful and yet kind way, and is able to keep people on timelines, I think it would be Ceci Cano. And I'd like to just highlight, I'm going to go back to one of Catherine's questions that I didn't answer, is this sort of building relationships. We looked for a staff member locally that was WhatsApping with the governor's personal secretary and with the heads and wives of all of the aerospace firms. And so this sort of relationship building we saw is really critical. We can teach project management, but we cannot teach someone to know to text the governor's assistant on her birthday and send flowers. And that investing in relationships we took to the extreme in our local staffing. And so I think that was a really critical piece. We built her technical skills substantially and invested a lot of time in that. But that we can build. It's very difficult to build someone into a honeybee that wasn't naturally that way. That's more of a wallflower. And so I think that was a critical piece. And I think that, and moving forward, we've sought to make similar hires where our staffer, we try to cite them within the appropriate local public or private sector organization so that they can continue this work. And I'd also like to highlight that there was a cluster manager that was often our local staffers' counterpart. And they also had a lot of skills built to be able to do these routines. And so I think those were two critical pieces of sustainability. I have another question for you, Renee. Are there any ongoing costs of sustaining this work? So when they think of this work, they're thinking of what's the cost of maintaining this cluster and the HR and this HR group that continues to talk with educational institutions? And how have the relationships been sustained without an intermediary?
Yeah, I think right after we finished the program, I will say that it took probably the immediate year. It was kind of hard because we were used to having you guys as intermediaries. But then we realized, okay, all this work is gonna get lost if we're gonna lose all this effort if we're not able to do something and maintain it. And I think the importance of the associations like Index, the Manufacturing Export Association, that hosts all the manufacturing sector, automotive, aerospace, medical, you name it, I mean, all of them. There's also a committee of human resources. And then within that is the aerospace cluster. So what we decided is that we need to centralize the follow-up in the association, because that's where the representation of the industry. And if there's no champion in this, we're gonna lose it. The educational institutions sometimes focus more on other things, and we lost probably over a year trying to figure it out. We did lose that stamina, that energy, you know, we lost it. And that's when we said, okay, guys, we need to get back. The work is there. It works. It was proven it works. We got results. And that's where we started again. Okay, we talked to the CONALEP, the technical institution. We start talking to other universities. We start doing that chart of skills and needs of technical and soft skills needs. We do that survey now every 2 years. It's part of our operation. It's part of the industry sector in the city. As a matter of fact, we just finished another one a few months ago. Some of the needs have changed. Unfortunately, English is still the top #1. So we're talking now to the institution saying, okay, you're going to have an engineer graduating, at least you need to do a test, TOEFL or something that we could measure their skills. And if they don't have it, I'm sorry, they cannot either graduate or you do something, you know. But we continue doing that. That's something that we inherited from that exercise. And I think now is a virtuous circle. And we've been able to identify new skills. We've been identifying other sort of training. If you allow me, I can tell you kind of an experience that organically arose with another institution, with Tech Milenio. They insisted we want the aerospace engineer. I said, no, you're not doing that program. You know, you're going to create a program that is going to create a lot of unemployed future students. So they said, okay, we have mechanical engineer. Perfect. What do you, and they said, what do you guys need? We said, we need engineers that understand the quality system for the aerospace sector. Yeah. So in 1 year, we created, with quality managers from all the companies, a program that is focused on AS9100 and NADCAP certifications, and understand the role of the FAA in the industry. And they wanted to call it a certificate. So, and future mechanical engineer is going to come up with a certificate in aerospace quality systems. And guess what? They are saving us a lot of money in training and making these guys understand what is a quality system in aerospace. They're doing the interns. One of the or the mandatory things is that they participate in an audit or quality audit for the company that they're doing their intern.
That's incredible, Rene. I have another urgent question for you from
Sure.
Larry Cooley. Larry is actually the father of this whole community of practice. And if there's ever anyone who may be considered one of the founding fathers of this entire industry, it's Larry. And he has a question for you.
Rene and Liz, I really want to compliment you. This is not only a terrifically presented case, it's a terrific accomplishment. And I say that as somebody who's failed several times to do exactly what you've succeeded in doing. So it's from that perspective, I want to ask a question and maybe make a little comment first, which is the hardest part, as you've said several times through the course of this, is trying to get the collective action to come together and to get the public and the private to somehow talk to each other in a language each understands and feels some accountability around. And one of the things that really struck me was not only how IOIF helped them initially bridge that divide, but how the industry side came together on its own out of a sense of collective action, which looking backwards seems perfectly logical, but I can tell you usually does not happen.
Right.
And you've given a lot of the elements that made this take place, but I think it's important for people listening to understand just how unusual it is to pull that off. And in a sense, this is the positive version of a perfect storm that I think you made happen there, and it's enormously to your credit. So here's my question. It feels to me like if this had been driven from the supply side, in other words, if the major energy for this was in the educational institutions, it wouldn't have worked. That it only worked because the two strong drivers in this were yourselves primarily, the private sector, and secondarily the IOIF role in trying to make the bridge. But if it had started on the other side of the transaction, I have a feeling it would not have worked in the same way. Do you think that's true or not true?
It's true. It's true because most of the programs that were developed before this, I think they created the programs. Let me rethink my words, because they were in a way successful. I mean, they did something, but I think they didn't hit the target of what the industry really needed. As I said, it takes two to dance, and a lot of the times the educational institutions try to create this program based on other information, other sources, but I think they hardly go to the local players. And in Mexico, or educational institutions are focused mainly on the regional part, in the regional needs. And that's something that we learned. We need to really understand what are the local needs of the established companies, their future plans of what technology they're going to bring. And I think it has been always a race in the universities or technical schools trying to catch up, chasing the needs of the industry. Not that we have been successful, but I think that gap has really been closer than ever.
Liz, can I just ask one related question to you? So who was it that had the good sense to bring IYF into this situation? How did that initial marriage take place?
So IYF, this was funded by USAID, and IYF had to work in Chihuahua and do a skills mismatch thing. And we looked around and we quickly identified what public sector partner would even be able to work with us. But then we went on an exhaustive search for what private sector actors. And we quickly determined that a chamber was too broad and a firm was too small. So then we were looking for clusters, which is a supply chain. In my understanding, I love René's. It's much more poetic, but my understanding is a supply chain with a freaking office that you can call, which for us was like that was like a gift from heaven. And so we started looking at the different clusters in the state that corresponded to lots of jobs. And so for us, we were looking at volume of employment, quality of employment. There were clusters that had to do with commerce, like buying and retail. And so we weren't interested in talking to them. And also we started to look at where the skills gap was. Where were people pirating where were they pirating from each other? Where did they actually have a human resources problem? Because I think, to your point, Larry, this cannot start from the public sector. And part of what we did at first was to try and, after working with the aerospace cluster here, we realized that a large part of our job was to spur collective action around human resources among private firms by scaring the bejeezers out of them, that this problem that they were facing is systemic. And we were so lucky that the aerospace cluster already had that understanding with their strategic growth plan.
I would say you're also very lucky that aid gave you the latitude to do that. That's also quite unusual in these programs. I mean, they sent you to Chihuahua, but they gave you a lot of breadth in terms of how to situate yourself there.
We were really lucky. It was a cooperative agreement, and we had some very sophisticated agreement officer representatives. So I track one around the world. There's a second question, and then I understand, René, you have to drop off at the hour because your central office people are in Chihuahua visiting. Yes. So I don't want to get you late. The last question is from Ruth. So in your new role with FEMIA, how are you taking this learning from Chihuahua to other states?
Great question. We're so lucky to have another important player at educational level in aerospace. His name is Jorge Gutierrez de Velasco. He was the former dean of the Aerospace University at Querétaro, DUNAC. And from the previous administration, now my administration, the FEMIA, he is the director or the president of the committee for the educational side. We're working now with 31 educational institutions through Mexico, in which Jorge really is benchmarking what we did in Chihuahua back then in 2014. He even mentioned, he said, you guys did what other regions haven't been able to do without an aerospace focused university like UNAC. So we're taking this and trying to adapt it to the needs of other regions in the country. So as I said, we're working with 31 universities and technical schools. I mean, total 31 institutions. And right now in Querétaro, we are doing the same exercise we did back then in Chihuahua. And we're gonna start replicating this exercise in the other aerospace regions of the country. So we're taking this as a great learning experience, and I think we're gonna be able to find out more. In fact, we just presented last week in FEMIA the plan for education of what we're gonna do, the agenda for the following years, and now it's not only the commercial and private aviation sector. We're starting to work with the Mexican Space Agency in order to really start looking at the space sector of where we want it to be in Mexico. And of course, we're going to need the educational part.
Renee,
may I ask, have you written this up as a case study so that it can be published more widely and shared therefore more widely as you're seeking to scale up?
No, I haven't. I think we're just, it's been word of mouth sharing. I think we should. That should be a great initiative, because other regions have heard about it and they want to do it. So I think this was, like you said, a great case study and experience, and we'll still continue learning from it.
Renee, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I don't want to hold you up for your meeting with headquarters. I see that Johannes has his hand. Johannes, if you want to say thank you. I know there's another question, but I also promised Renee that he would be able to get out at the hour.
That's fine.
Well, I have 3 minutes, so.
Thank you so much, Renee, for joining us. This was actually this particular session so far already, and I hope we continue a little bit with you, Liz.
Yes.
Was a terrific compliment to yesterday's brief introduction, the 4-minute introduction of this case by Liz. And I have to say, this model of looking at a particular case in some depth, as we have done today, and linking it back to the broader debate that we've had in the community practice of sort of how do you deal with individual scaling up efforts, but also in the context of a system that you need to work with and adjust to. I think this combination of today's discussion and yesterday's exploration of the broader context and issues is really fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us today, Renee. Liz, I have actually a couple of questions for you beyond if we have still some time, but there may be others. Thank you.
Renee, thank you so much. I truly appreciate your time. And
Thank you, Liz.
Johannes, fire away.
Okay, so couple of points, and I want to put you a bit more on the spot with regard to this question of exit and preparing for exit, because Renee told us, that for a year there were problems, and it reminds me a bit of retirement. Retire, and unless you plan very carefully, the first year is kind of, you fall into a big black hole until you dig yourself out, and it's kind of a wasted year. So fortunately, Renee and his friends and colleagues dug themselves out and now seem to be going blazes, which is wonderful. But, it could have gone the other way. So my question to you is, what did you guys do in, say, the last year of your project, funded by USAID, and the usual, you had to deliver to USAID your project reports and whatever. How much time and effort did you actually devote to thinking about and doing something about that, what happens after you go? I mean, maybe you did a lot, and that would be very important to know. Maybe you didn't, and maybe one of the lessons that you might, looking back, you might have learned is that, hey, we maybe should have done a bit more. So actually that to me is the main point. I raised another question in this. But let's leave that aside for now. Although that point about quick wins actually is an important lesson that Richard and I actually have to include more, I think, in our consideration of principles than we have so far. So thank you for that particular guidance. But how about that exit vision issue?
Yeah, so we did a lot of work around, first of all, there was a change of government, which I think is really important. The state government changed the year before we left, which was awesome because that means all the public sector actors changed. Every single one, except for one guy. Thank God. But he was demoted, unfortunately. And so we spent a lot of time orienting them to the project and the expectations. We spent some significant time figuring out of the champions that we had employed, where they were going to sit within government to continue to promote this. So they actually created, they changed a direction at the Secretary of Education to include a role that had to do with this articulation between industry and education sector, who previously would have just been sort of doing a sort of a compliance role around certifications. So now you had she had a team that were dedicated to working with industry and schools and running between them. But we had, unfortunately, the head of the most autonomous school system did not understand the project. And so it was really critical that you had the Secretary of Education on board supporting it with a new staff supporting it. And you had the industry cluster with an expectation. We also worked changing some national policies around staffing of industry educational articulation bodies. So they have a requirement to establish these bodies, almost like governing boards for technical upper secondary systems. And those boards, they didn't have any staffing requirements. So this new general director of the most autonomous school district all of a sudden had new responsibilities where he had to take input from industry and carry it back to his academic director and review his curriculum, which was not a requirement before. So we changed the rules of the game on this person. We created an authority structure around them locally so that they would be responsive. But we did not, but what we did not do was provide appropriate orientation or support for index or the cluster. So I think that was one of our big learnings, was that, sort of helping them understand the role that we had played, because they had some excellent staffers that I'd like to highlight were pirated by the National Aviation Authority. I'm talking about Monica de la Vega, who could have played that sort of coaching role that we played with the educational institutions to say, you're late. You said you were going to do this. It doesn't meet specs. And that is not what we did. And that was a big learning. Renee, you have your hand up.
Well, now just to thank you guys so much. You didn't know how much I enjoy this. I think we could spend hours talking about this and continue sharing the experiences. And I bet there are more questions, but feel free if you guys think there's another session or part 2 for this conversation. I'm in. Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you soon, guys.
Thank you so much, Renee.
Thanks, Renee.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Guys, if you want to take off your mutes and turn on your cameras, if anyone has any further questions, it's just going to be us chickens.
I have a question, Liz. This is really back in the weeds, but it's something you talked about before in terms of your cooperative agreement with USAID. It had pre-identified Chihuahua as a place to work and had been silent on the issue of which schools, which industries, and what process. Was that something that you had co-designed with them, or had somebody had the perspicacity to structure it that way in the first place?
We had, I'd like to highlight our previous regional director at IYF, Susan Pizzulo. She came up with a proposal that I keep on trying to replicate to USAID, which was, there's a big problem that no one has solved, so we're going to have a pool of program innovation funds, and we'll fail lots and try things, and we'll use IYF's proven practices. But it was a lot of smoke and mirrors.
Well, you know, if there's something, this is a collective action problem on our side, but if there's something that we could write up about that, in other words, how the structuring of that made possible, you're performing the role the way you did. I'm not taking anything away from the way you performed it. I mean, you did beautifully with this, but you were given the possibility of doing that with latitude that's not normally present. Yep. And if we could figure out a way to fold that into our conversations about mainstreaming, what it is that we're asking donor organizations to do, I think it would be a real contribution.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to do that, and I think I can pull up that cooperative agreement because there was very little that we had committed to. We had committed to coming up with plans, and we had committed to coming up with analyses. But we didn't commit to any actions, and we referred back to our cooperative agreement with every new AOR when they wanted us to count heads, like, how many teachers have you trained? And we were like, we don't know what we need to train them in yet. And so I'm happy to pull that out as an example and help write up that case study.
And one last question on that. If you had not found a cluster of the sort that the aerospace turned out to be in this, would your actions have included trying to help occasion that? Try to, yeah.
Yeah, so what we've had to do with others is we've started to work with, so we're helped in the case of Mexico by the fact that they were run by socialists for 70 years, and you couldn't have a firm without being part of some private sector organization. So and then they shifted from that when they were looking at the private sector in like the early 2000s to clusters. So there are a lot of clusters in Mexico. There are actual organizations and not economic geography concepts, which is a huge help. But what we've done in Mexico specifically is we've worked with baby clusters, so ones that are on paper only, and worked with sometimes part of their supply chain nearby that is more organized to create a cluster. And then we do a lot of work with both baby and fully mature clusters to identify critical skills up and down their supply chain.
That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I saw hands. Johannes.
Yeah, actually, this is for Hisham. You know, Hisham, you're working with an organization in Marseille that's trying to strengthen employment opportunities for young people in the Mediterranean, North Africa in particular, and Arab countries. And, you know, I've seen your proposal and I realize that actually this particular example that Liz has now presented could be of huge relevance to you. In your case, you're dealing with municipalities that are to sort of develop training facilities and what have you, training programs and potentially placement programs for young people. I'm sort of wondering whether you have, you know, there's anything to learn, let me put it this way, from Liz's and IYF's analysis, system analysis, the power analysis, which by the way, I really think is wonderful. I've never seen anything quite like it, that matrix that you prepared. So I'm wondering whether, Hisham, you want to say a little bit about your reaction to this as somebody who's working on another youth program. What are your takeaways? Are there any lessons to be learned? Is there anything to to be sort of, incorporate into the way you look at what you're doing in the Mediterranean. Thank you. Over.
Hisham unfortunately had to drop off the call because he's in a call with USAID right now.
Oh, okay.
So it was he was convened. And when they say jump, you say how high.
Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry, I'll raise it with him directly. But it's a kind of an interesting question more generally for others who are on the call who are working on youth programs in particular. Sort of, is there anything to be learned in these different settings from, and what are sort of the core elements? We're getting back to sort of what are the core elements of Liz's approach, or IYF's approach, in this case, that carry over into other settings.
Ruth.
Yes, I have a question for you, Liz, that is based on the principles paper developed by Richard and Johannes. The first principle of scaling is developed from the outset a shared inclusive vision of impact at optimal scale. So my question to you, Liz, is were you able from the outset to have such a vision? And if not, at what stage did you develop the broader vision for impact at scale?
So we stumbled on that because we did have a mandate from USAID. There were some things that we could and couldn't do. So we had sort of our rules of the game for us. But we were also required by USAID to create a multi-stakeholder alliance that had all these same people, but multiple other sectors. So we did this also with automotive, IT. We did this a lot. This is one example. But what we did is we got the private sector and the public education sector in the room, and it was like all the private sector sat on one side and talked in one language, and the public sector sat on the other side and spoke in another language. So the private sector spoke about return on investment, turnover rate. The public sector spoke about the terminal efficiency, which I never really understood what the hell that meant. It's like the graduation rate, but it sounds really morbid. And they talked about learning units, and they had their own internal certification processes that seem very important, but totally irrelevant to industry. And the first thing that we realized is that these people could not talk to each other. They literally couldn't talk to each other. I, who don't speak Spanish, well, I speak Spanish, but it's my second language, was ending up translating between two people who lived down the street from each other because they had totally different interests and totally different language to express it. And so one of the first things that we did is we didn't literally take out a checkbook, but we pretty much took out a checkbook. And we said, look, when this side, Mars, can agree with Venus on a goal that will lead to increased youth employability, we will finance a pilot. If and only if everyone agrees that if it proves results that we all agree on, it will be institutionalized and scaled. And so the first thing that we did, but they still couldn't talk to each other. So the first thing that we did was we said, look, we need to understand what the problem is. And so we came up with a series of questions as a group that IYF had already prepared, but they thought they came up with themselves. It's almost like when you're coming up with rules of engagement, like these are our ground rules. You all know that it's going to be like, we're not going to be on our cell phones while we're talking. We're going to respect other people. You already know what the list is. So we had some questions that we thought were important, but they came up with on their own in their own language. And then we worked with both sides to come up with answers to those questions. And I will be honest that it took a lot of support, or what we like to call bracketing, for the public sector actors to be able to engage in that, where we basically got inputs from everyone. And then at their next meeting, we had turned it into an understandable report with common language that we told them that they had written together. And that was their first early win. And that was a shared understanding of the problem. And that then led us to a series of proposals that we used a modified consensus decision-making approach to where you basically take the table that I showed of power and interest, and you just chart interest, but you keep the power part in your head as the facilitator. And you basically are asking people to rate their level of support for different proposals. But that led us to a series of actions and agreed upon results that we could all agree on. So that gave us a common vision for the place that we wanted to go. But we realized that it took coming up with a common diagnosis. And that is where technical facilitation is really critical. Jenny wants me to share a slide, so I'm gonna just quickly share it. It's this one, I think. There you go, Jenny. So you've got how powerful someone is in relation to your project or the change that you want to make. And then how much they support or not a particular proposal, which is from sort of 1 to 5, both on 1 to 5. And you are basically trying to move everyone to the top right. Well, everyone that's in the top 3 rows over to the right is your goal.
I
The,
think
the, the variations on these, Johannes, if you're looking in the literature for these, they're called power maps.
I see. Yeah. Well, I think it's a really good contribution to our discussion because I hadn't quite seen. I mean, they're very logical and so on, and once you see them, they're perfectly obvious that that's something you ought to think about. But the fact that you've showed it to us and introduced it into our process, I think, is very helpful as a tool. And it's actually an example of how simple tools, and this is a very simple tool, can actually be extremely helpful. And they're not particularly, heavy and time-consuming. It's just a mindset and then a tool to help create the proper mindset. So I think this is, to me, this is a beautiful example of how simple tools can actually help tremendously.
They come, and just to be clear, to give due credit where credit is due, this comes from community organizing. So community organizers use this when they're figuring out who should be the targets of their organizing efforts. They're trying to figure out who is powerful in relation to a change that they want to see. So it comes from a place of people trying to make change that have very little power officially, and then figuring out who has the power over the decision that they want to see made, and then how to target them appropriately.
And I'll tell you, it really works too. This was, I originally borrowed this from Saul Alinsky to kind of reinforce what Liz was saying. And we use this throughout that 11-year implementing policy change program as maybe the most commonly used tool, most effectively used and frequently used tool.
Yeah, we basically, from this, we then do a second level analysis where everyone in the top 3 rows, we do an interest table where we try and figure out what's the incentive structure that they operate in, and then what are the risks and opportunities that this change represents to that person or interest group, and then what then are the levers for change, and then the levers for change become the tasks of your local staffers or yourself. And so, some of it can be like this person, some of it can be very formal, like this person wants political recognition. How do we do that? Some of it can be much less formal, which is this person is, would like a friend. And how do we do that? And so, yeah, I feel like it's sort of dirty poker. But I feel like if anybody deserves dirty poker to be played for them, it's young people, because what you'll see in these ecosystems is no one's really looking out for the needs of young people. Any other questions or comments? Cool. Oh, Larry, go ahead.
No, I was just coming on to thank you for a really terrific session.
Thank you.
You can tell by the level of energy everybody thought so, but I know how much work goes into making that happen. So thanks so much for doing it.
Of course. Thank you guys. And I will share with Renee everybody's thanks and comments. He seems really excited. And it looks like he wants to write up a case study. So I'll follow up with him. I'll follow up with him also about the English thing.
Liz, if I can, since we're talking about case studies, I think this is actually an interesting case, both for our systems versus scaling cross-cutting agenda, but it equally serves, and I realized that in my own case that I wrote up a while ago, it also serves the principles, can serve the principles discussion where we also will, I think, want to pursue cases. So I don't know how we're doing this and whether you or Renee will have the time and resources, but I think this is, for many reasons, a really interesting case, and we ought to exploit it as far as we can. So thanks so much. It's a terrific addition to our, I think, to our experience base and evidence base.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to help. Catherine, I saw you come on with your video. Thanks.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you with a face. It was a very interesting presentation. I always learn a lot from these very specific examples. I was going to actually propose before everybody leaves, I'd be interested in knowing if there are other organizations that in hearing this feel like they have another example of a similar scale that they might be able to share at another time, because I'm always trying to learn. Not everybody's funding allows for anything to be scaled up. So identifying which organizations have gotten the right kind of funding collaboration to do this, as Larry pointed out, is very interesting. I don't know if we can see in the chat other cases.
I think I have an opening. It's not an answer to your question, Kathy, okay. But I think if we get around to writing that up, I think I have an opening for pitching that within USAID. So I think there's a direct potential payoff to having a good articulation of that approach to doing this sort of work. It may be as simple as, if it really is well laid out in the cooperative agreement itself, Liz, it may be as simple as saying, look, this is an example of what worked. If it's not, if it took a lot of ingenuity on the part of the people involved to work with what they had to make that happen, then it would be a little more effort on our part to put it together in a way that we could ask it presented as a replicable model.
Well, let's also, if we want to do that, let's get the agreement officer representative that we worked with most closely, who started out being the supervisor of our agreement officer representative, but they closed down the office, so he ended up being ours. But he's great, and I think he'd be happy to work with us on that, because he was. Are
you happy to reach out to him? I'm happy to be part of a call or a conversation with him if he's receptive.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. He's a lovely guy. I think you would really enjoy meeting him.
Okay.
Anyways, and then Catherine, to your point, I would love to convene us as a working group to chart out our plan for next year. And if you would help me formulate that into a question, okay. I'd love that to be our agenda. One of our agenda items is we figure out what we want to do next year, because I feel like Hisham had great intellectual leadership for this group this year, helping pose these critical questions that we all tried to come up with case studies and responses to. But I think let's think together about our December work group meeting, which will hopefully be short and just be planning for next year. So we can get everybody's input, and we can also do an email poll. We can try and get all the input we can, all the ways we can.
That sounds good. Yeah, I think, for example, the Egypt WISE project was at a scale. It would be interesting to hear more details of that. Maybe some other examples people have on their minds.
Does anyone have an example they'd like to share in response to Catherine's question?
Is Hisham back? Because if he's back, then I can pose my question to him, which is kind of
I sincerely apologize. I had a very intense meeting at USAID, and probably Larry knows about that. I've been working on it for a long time. I could not say no.
No. That's not to worry, Hisham. But if we can continue for a few more minutes, Liz.
Yeah.
So Hisham, my question to you was, until I realized that you had to leave, so you've listened, and maybe you knew this example in some depth that we discussed today. And I was reminded of your and Helvetas and what's the organization in Marseille? I keep forgetting its name. Anyway,
CMI.
Yes, your proposal to work with municipalities in the Mediterranean region, as Arab countries in particular, for youth employment creation and intermediation and what have you. Are there lessons to be learned from the way IYF approached this in this particular case, and maybe similar cases that you're familiar with. For example, this systems analysis, the ecosystem analysis, the power analysis that we discussed and looked at in some detail earlier, which I thought, was a new tool for me, but apparently is well established. Anyway, are there things that are carry over potentially among sort of core ideas? Indeed, what are the core ideas that you might want to carry over into your new project? I wonder whether you have any reaction to that question.
No, that's a very fascinating. I really like that. I mean, I always remember Larry Cooley's statement that complexity is #1 enemy of scaling up. So, and he always bring us to think about simplification, not addition. And we, including myself, as international development expert, we tend to add, oh, why don't we connect the young people with the bank? Oh, why don't we do that? Well, I mean, it's fantastic. It's all needed. But I think one issue I struggled with when I developed that concept note with your friend Blanca and Martin is they want to put a lot of load on the shoulder of municipalities. And I'm saying, let's do an assessment, see what they can offer. Let's start from the concept of assets-based approach, meaning like do what they can offer, right? And that's one lesson learned is like we ask too much from local partners, and we sometimes tend to forget that they need a lot to be able to do the basic stuff, right? The other thing I learned from that experience, Johannes, is mayors talk to each other and listen to each other more than me, definitely. They're just not interested in me sitting in Washington telling ex-mayor and Min Hada, who's the hell? Min Hisham sitting there. So what I did in this concept, I presented this internal champion idea, meaning like catalyst of leadership within the mayors themselves. So I identify mayors to talk and promote the project internally. And that's actually, let's talk about that. The issue of the concept of sustainable longer-term financial model to sustain this concept of, I cannot reveal too much information about the concept because I don't own it, Johannes. But I mean the whole concept of having the municipality look at much more fees for services approach or much more longer term investment funds, that IFC mindset, rather World Bank mindset is challenging, right? So you want to give them $50,000. We need to make sure that this $50,000 not spent for Abu Ahmed building another room for the municipality. We need just to have the mindset of like invest the money for the good of the people. So the three takeaway from developing that concept note. I think they are advancing. I'm not with them anymore, but I think they want me to work with UN Ops for that. But it's a fascinating model. I see a lot of similarities between what I hear today and that model. But I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If there's any more comments or questions, we're going to have to close at the half hour. I'm just really grateful for everyone for participating today and for your questions, your comments. And we will, of course, follow up with some bullet points for the newsletter. And I will work with Johannes, Larry, and Ruth and Renee to come up with a case study of this particular piece.
Perfect.
And hopefully have it aligned with systems and scaling and principles of scaling and request for USAID to come up with more of these actually reasonable cooperative agreements, because I feel like I've been working with funders for forever that are like, I want to create a movement, but first you need to deliver to me like 100 beneficiaries of this sort. And you're like,
yeah,
you can do one or the other, but not both.
Right.
So thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
But you're the superhero,
Yes,
superhero
yeah.
Liz. Come on, you can do it.
See you,
drive the child to school now.
Good to see you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Guys.
Thanks
Thanks,
for all for
everybody.
joining. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.